This is part of a broader question around what actually makes product management, right? Because like with the advent of things like product ops and all these AI tools, how many things could we technically outsource?
Maybe a controversial view, how much of this is a problem based on some of the things we said, right? Like if strategy requires making bets about the future.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a problem.
We're going to go through the product ops report that I know you were one of 3 co-authors. I'm assuming there's probably other people involved, especially in collaboration with Airfocus. I was digesting it. This is where like the brainchild of this thing came from, and you just got a random ping from me,
Right.
like pretty much in that moment too. So like I was reading, I like downloaded it and I was like bookmarked it to read, and I was going through it and I was digesting it. And then I was thinking, wouldn't this be really cool to like, I could just be like going through this live and like talking about my thoughts. And then I thought, well, hey, you know, I know the people at Airfocus, I know you. I was like, well, why don't, even better to kind of do that with one of the co-authors. And then I literally like sent you a message. I was like, hey, random idea, but would you be up for it? And kind enough to say yes. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for having me. I think I always enjoy collaborating with you, and I think the report is something really special. And I love that we managed to make it so insightful. So I'm really excited to dig even deeper.
Yeah, so I'm keen to just get straight really into it. So I'm going to open the report now. Let's do this. Okay, cool. So I want to start not at the top thing. I want to start at the second thing, chapter 2, because this was probably the most contentious or
right.
came out of it. And this was this idea that what you found in I guess your research and or the team's research around it was that only 18% of decisions, strategic decisions, I guess there's probably some precursor there, is being informed by the market or user feedback. In fact, a large portion, the majority, 58%, admitting to it being intuition only. I want to just start with like, I want to hear how, like, because obviously you were synthesizing this. I'll make an assumption too, right? And you saw this. What was your reaction? Yeah, how did you, when you saw this?
Yeah, so this, and I think this is probably true for most of the things in the report. There were some things that truly surprised me, but I think this was the sort of topic where it was like, I could have kind of guessed, but I'm still surprised. Because I think a lot of the time when I speak to my coaches or I engage with a new client, everybody thinks they're the only company that's struggling. You know, everybody thinks like, wow, everybody else is so data driven. They've really got things figured out. They embed customer feedback into their ways of working. And here I am just guessing, right? And I think the vast majority of companies actually are in that second bucket, but we don't often super openly talk about it. Now, the interesting thing about this one in particular is that this was specifically about strategic decisions, and this was specifically about leadership, right? And I think, and this is simply my theory, but I think what is happening here is not that the vast majority of product leaders just, you know, go with the wind and sort of decide the product strategy that way. I think what's happening is that leaders just aren't very good at showing their thinking or sort of showcasing everything that goes into a major strategic decision.
You know what I thought about when you said that? I thought about, actually, I was thinking about this quote, if I can zoom in to make it easier for people to see. I was thinking about basically what you just said, right? And the vision and stuff. So here's the 2 things that came through my head as you said it. If it's focused in on strategic decisions, then intuition, especially especially if it was aimed at leadership at the higher echelons, I don't know if this is a safe assumption, but you could assume that they have a lot of product sense, or like a good amount of product sense. They've probably spent a lot of time in data already and market research and stuff. And whilst it may feel like intuition, it probably is backed by years of experience plus good product sense, which is like their experience, and whether that's anecdotal or not, but like it's the culmination of lots of actual insights, believe it or not. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a good point, right? Like, you don't want 100% of decisions made by data, because then you're just blindly following a dashboard somebody else built that is also built on a bunch of assumptions, right? And I think with leaders, and especially when we look to the startup founder space, right, those people have been deeply, deeply embedded. They've been thinking about the subject matter and the problem space day and night, right? So that relying on some of that product sense absolutely makes sense, because they're the best person positioned to do this. But it's very interesting to see how this permeates through the organization as an opinion, right? I think that's what I find really interesting.
Yeah, and that was so you just literally said the second point that also went through my head, when which was, there is definitely a world when you think about strategic decisions. I talk about this with strategy all the time. Some people might have heard me talk about this. One of the hard parts about strategy is you're trying to look at data, but then you also need to put in your hypotheses and beliefs about what the future is going to hold. And it's actually the mixture of these two, because if we only make decisions on the data that's available to us, we're making decisions about that is based on the past, not on the future, right? And past data, whilst can often be a good predictor for future conditions, it is not always a predictor for future conditions. So if you think something's going to really change, so that's, I guess, the hard part about strategy. So there's just a natural element that it involves intuition and beliefs and like narratives about what you believe, where we're going in the future. I also think if you only do the data, everybody has that data, or at least similar data, and you're not going to really change the world or be too competitive and differentiated if you're just making decisions based on what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an interesting point, right? That I love enabling teams to be more data driven, but it can only get you so far in that. That's not necessarily going to breed innovation, right? Like, at some point, you do have to have an opinion. You do have to go after these moonshots that takes your company to the next stage. So yeah, really valid point.
I wonder what your take would be on this. If this was done not at a strategic level, not at a leadership level, would we see similar results?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I think in a different part of the report, folks are actually highlighting that they don't trust the data they have, right, in their organization. And again, that is something that I've seen time and again, that even if companies invested into, building out their web dashboards, making sure it's readily accessible, at some point, trust in that data collapsed. And I actually think that is a very common state to be in, where product managers are empowered to look at the data, right? Do have sort of the, let's say, authority to make decisions based on problems to solve and not just get given solutions. But if you do not have that trust that the data you're looking at is correct, then everything else does not matter. And you're back to making assumptions, right? You're back to just having opinions and running with them and hope that your shot in the dark was actually the right one.
I'm playing something back just because I'm making an assumption here. Do you think that those two things are related, right? Like confidence in data versus like kind of this, or if we were to do this at a lower level, where was the confidence in data? It was like here, right? Or yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Do you think it's related? Decisions, low confidence in data, we avoid it.
Yeah, I mean, at a PM level, If you have no confidence in the data, there's absolutely no reason for you to look at it. It's actually more difficult to then try and go and extract faithful data that you believe to be correct or you believe can give you insights than just continuing on the path of, I already have a given amount of experience in this field. I believe this to be the correct next step based on my own intuition. I'm not 100% sure it correlates to how we view leaders making decisions, to be honest, because I think the data we talk about at a more strategic or leadership level is slightly higher level, even. So it is more about market data. It's more about what's happening with the competition and slightly less about, which funnel is performing. That's something I would consider PMs to look at, not necessarily leadership.
So I'm going to get back to data, but like, I think maybe a controversial view, how much of this is a problem based on some of the things we said, right? Like if strategy requires making bets about the future, if it
Yes.
requires a level of product sense, and we're not saying that, or at least you don't believe that there's complete intuition inside this. Like
Yeah.
there's some substance, product sense, years of experience behind it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's a problem. I think the problem arises when individual contributors feel disenfranchised with this, right? And I think it's part of role modeling good behavior. And honestly, I also think leaders are doing themselves a disservice by just pretending it's 99% intuition, right? And maybe that goes back into, well, what do we believe is intuition? Like if a leader said, I have this big bet, I think this is, going to succeed enough for me to be willing to put a year of our product organization's resources behind it. But I believe this because XYZ, right? I think it's this XYZ that is missing a lot of the time. And leaders really do themselves a disservice because I think the way they think about their industry, they think about their product, their competitors, could be so, so valuable if they surface that to the entire team.
Yeah, and I think I mean, you said this as a bit of you said this down here, right? But most often they're acting on concrete information, just information that's not privy to other people.
Right.
Equally, you also talk about the not this part. I think it's the next one around actually sharing the information. Yeah, showing your thinking. I think this is a good lesson. I'd like to hear your take on it. For product leaders in particular, but product managers as well, which is like, I always think about the Netflix principle of context over control and communicating that context. And like, it's how you came to that decision is just as important as the decision itself, arguably
100%.
possibly even more important.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, it's like any maths problem, right? Like in high school, it was drilled into us.
Show you're working, right? Yeah,
exactly. Show you're working. Like, don't just give me the solution. Show me how you got to that. And it's exactly the same with communicating strategy.
And I think decisions in general. So I think if you were to make a prioritization call, hey, we're going to chase this opportunity over this one. You kind of framed it before. Here's the reasons why, because of X, Y, Z, kind of
right.
Whatever information you have, mix of belief versus information. You just got me, I'm going on an actual tangent on this one, but you just got me thinking, I actually wonder if thinking about leaders doing themselves a disservice, and this is maybe not so actionable for those who aren't leaders on listening to this, but you got me thinking about whether we also need to communicate or be clearer around the difference. So the strategic decision thing, I think we've really honed in on was very important and pertinent here. With like, we're not saying 18% data informed decisions across all decisions, really strategic decisions. And then we also spent a good amount of time explaining why we actually see that as a feature, not a bug, right? Like to a degree, yeah. But like being clear around, this is a strategic decision, which means that there's an element of assumptions, beliefs in it. And actually, I talk about this with strategy a lot too, which is like being clear on those assumptions as well, communicate them, but then we also should track them. Because if those assumptions turn out to no longer be true at some stage in the future, then we probably should pivot our strategy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just as important to talk about what you're not doing, right? Like these are the two big bets we're prioritizing, and these are the things we're actively not going after. And that is just as much of a decision, a strategic one, as communicating the things that you are doing.
I'm going to put myself in the shoes of somebody who might be listening right now. Let's say I'm not a product leader, I'm a product manager, and I feel like my product leader is not sharing that context. Is there anything I can do?
Honestly, ask questions, right? And it doesn't have to be in a combative way or anything like that, but genuinely be curious, because I think that is the easiest way to really get the answers you need and to uncover all of this context that, yeah, maybe your leader isn't very good at giving outright, but is absolutely there, right? So I think, go in with the best of intention, ask questions, and then also share what you have learned through these conversations.
Yeah, I love that. Pretty much what I would say. I don't have anything more to add on that one. I want to go back to trust, because we'll go to trust, because somebody also made a comment about it as well. Hearing the same thing.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, like, do you have any additional thoughts as to root causes as to why trust is low? Obviously, this came out as well. Yeah. Why don't we trust the data?
So I think the interface between product and data teams is really, really interesting. Most of the times, companies do have at least one dedicated data person, but I've never understood this. They are almost always completely separate functions, right? You've got the data team over there, and you've got the product team over here. And sometimes you can be really lucky and you're in a company that has an analyst, maybe even embedded in every product team. That's the ideal case scenario, right? But more often than not, product and data folks tend to think about and look at data differently, right? There is a mismatch in experience with data tools, first of all. The data teams also often have to care about many more things than just surfacing product data, right? They've got requests coming in from execs. They actually have to build and maintain the entire infrastructure that goes into surfacing data. And a lot of the time, when you have this mismatch, or when you have this sort of lack of collaboration, let's say, you might end up with completely different ideas of what the data means, simply because all data is based on assumptions, right? The things that you decide to measure meaningfully impact what you see and the way you decide to measure them as well. And this is the simplest example, but it's one I bring up all the time. What does an active user mean, right? What defines active in your particular context? Is it time? Is it a specific action? And if you don't know that, and you're simply looking at the dashboard that says active users have gone up, you're still mostly flying blind, right? You have no idea how to influence that if you don't go a level deeper into the data definitions. And I think that's what happens a lot of the time.
I laugh because I had this conversation yesterday. It's like, what do you mean by active? Like, let's define it. It's more complicated than, oh, they logged in today. It's like, okay, so they logged in and just posted straight away. Like, I don't think that's active. Like,
exactly.
If anything, that's like disengaged and like kind of heading towards churn. So, it made me wonder how many people, like, this is probably an observation I have as well, which is spending time defining these things.
Yeah.
And the amount of effort as well that actually goes into it. I think people grossly underestimate that.
Yes.
It's not like, oh, we're just going to have this magic active user thing and it's like, we're going to track it. It's like, no, we need to define what that means for us. And then sometimes that becomes actually a complex thing because it's not this specific action. It's actually this specific action this many times.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. And the marketing and sales teams might have different opinions as well. Like that's the wonderful but super hard thing about data. You need to have consensus across the board. Because if your sales team is looking at different metrics, they think everything's going wonderfully, or conversely, they think everything's terrible, but you're like plugging along in your little bubble. It's in long term, you will hit roadblocks.
And I'm not sure if you've seen this too, but I actually really like that you called out this piece about like making sure data teams don't, which speaks to your comment about the disconnect, that data teams cannot be allowed to become some type of service center that's like take a ticket. And
right.
when I've seen that happen as well, I've also seen that these definitions and the shared understanding also becomes fractured, and that also leads to the distrust. And if we could take active users as an example here, where if they will have an opinion on what active users is, but in actual fact, you could argue they're not the right people to have an opinion on it because they're actually one or two steps removed from the customers and the people, the product, right? I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really where that disconnect starts. Is so often I've seen data teams create these definitions in isolation. And maybe at one point they're surfacing it to a leader who is in charge of the data team, right? But a lot of the time, that kind of foundational work doesn't usually include product people. And why not, right? These are the perfect people to be able to tell, this is the user behavior that we mean when we say active, when we say engaged, right? And I think that's a collaboration that needs to strengthen much, much more. And it's exactly as you said, like this, the worst form of this is when you have a data team that is constantly overworked, for starters, because everybody comes to them with requests, right? It's this push and pull between true self-service, right, and then getting an expert in to help you really dig deep. And I think the ideal case scenario is that you do have a robust enough data structure that product managers, with a base level of understanding of data and analytics tools, can go in and can see the things that are most important to them. And this inaccessibility of data, right? This is another big thing, because if it takes me 2 days to sort of refigure out what all of the dashboard means and really understand whether there are filters on a particular thing or not, what I'm actually looking at, whether I'm looking at the right thing, that's when people gradually stop doing it, because it's more difficult than the payoff, right?
I want to get into talking about some of the things about like the setup with data and stuff. But before I do, you made me think of something that I see as well, which is like the pain of getting the data is so high that we could just go and do some like research, for example, like qualitative, because like we're talking a lot about quant here. Like I could just go and do some qualitative stuff, and it shouldn't be easier, but it actually is easier. And then I might just rely on the little bit of qual I get, as opposed to even looking at any of the quants.
Yeah.
On this one, so I definitely, there's some things down here, but I think I want to touch on it. I want to ask your opinion on solving this problem from two lenses. One from like a product ops lens, because some places will have product ops teams and people who will be able to, I'm also making an assumption that this is a general, well, it's not necessarily assumption, it's informed. I know that this is a common space that product ops does look at. It's like companies definitely trying to help with this. So one question about how product ops can help solve some of this. And the second one would be, imagine a world where, because some of people listening won't have product ops, what can I do as an individual contributor?
Yeah. So I'll start with that one. What can I do as an individual contributor? And honestly, it's as easy as engaging your data team sooner, right? I started in quality assurance, and when I started, a lot of the best practices were about shift left, right? Involve testers early and often, right? So that in the discovery phase, we can already start thinking about, well, what happens if the user strays away from the happy path? Stuff like that. Data is exactly the same. Even in the discovery phase, right? Engage a data person and tell them, listen, this is the behavior I'm trying to affect. How do you think, like, which measures can I look at to make sure that this behavior has actually changed, right? Treat them more as partners or even internal consultants, if you will, right? Over just being a service center where, oh, I need some data, I'm going to throw a ticket over the wall, and then maybe 2 weeks from now, I get some disjointed numbers and I've completely forgotten about the initiative. So I think just engaging them earlier and often. Now, I will say that that necessitates they have the time to do that. And that's when we start going more towards the organizational barriers, right, of unblocking data teams. And in product operations, I just love being that link, right? I love being able to take some of those things off the data team's hands in terms of even just starting with education on the data tools so that PMs can actually self-serve successfully, but also being that person that sort of pipes up and says, like, when was the last time we looked at how we measure what we measure, right? It's just an additional brain in the room, let's say, to make those connections. And I think then from the product ops perspective, I mean, sometimes you really only need to make that link of saying, hey, in this discovery process, let's think about how we involve data teams. I've run the whole gamut of actually working very closely with data teams together and setting it up from scratch, but sort of correctly and with self-service in mind first and foremost. So I think the involvement from product ops people can vary wildly depending on the resources that are already there, right? The relative maturity that is already there. But I think what we have to remember with data, it's not just about looking at the success of features. It's not just about looking at your next design sprint or your next discovery process phase and understand whether you already have some insights. This goes, if you have OKRs, you need to be able to track your OKRs, right? This goes all the way up to strategy. Are we actually going in the right direction? Like, data genuinely permeates every single aspect of product management. And that's why it's so important that those teams get closer together.
I love that answer. And you actually had this. So a few things. So I think people can take away. Bring in. I like the shift left, like the QA to
Right.
resonate a lot. Shift left. Bring data in earlier. I sounded like you advocate as well for, which I would, to at a world where we can like kind of self-service data as much as possible. Obviously,
Yes.
there's no expertise that sits somewhere, but like the more we can enable teams. And you had a bit of a maturity litmus test here, which I
Right.
liked, which was, I'm just going to read it, which is, to understand where your organization is really at, try to measure the time it takes between a product manager articulating a data need and getting that need met. And to make that clear, I'm assuming you mean they actually can get that like data, or yeah, if it's longer than 2 hours and relies on external parties, your organization is probably not set up to become truly data driven. And I think just
Right.
not too set up for success in the product model, I think, for sure, or at least not setting up product managers and product teams for success. I don't know if you have anything else to add on to that, but I think it's a good litmus test. I wanted to call it out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly the crux of the issue, right? If it's difficult as for me as a PM to get data, and or if it takes a long time, that is not a value add to my role. That doesn't make me better as a product person. It doesn't make me more able to deliver value, right? And yeah, I think it's an interesting test, right? From like, oh, I have a question, I wonder what, blah 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 blah, to actually getting that answer. It should not be difficult.
Yeah, and put it this way: if it starts to take days, as an
Right.
alternative extreme, it falls into that bucket. Like I said, and I've seen teams fall in it. They're just like, "Well, I'll just go ask a bunch of customers because I can probably get that done in 24 hours." Than having to wait 3 days to try and go through all the hoops because like external parties, and they're like, "Why do you need the data?" and take a ticket and wait your turn. And
Right.
on the data thing as well, I think one of the things we've discussed is confidence being about, like, so we talked about definitions around that, like shared understanding. What do we mean by certain things? Something that's been floating through my head as well around this is the difference between, because I see this all the time, I'm sure you do too. The difference between, and I always think about it from a research, like really scientific research perspective, the difference between primary like research and secondary research. In other words, primary being research that you did versus secondary, which is quoting somebody else. And I definitely see that manifest itself in the trust part of data and insights in general a lot. Like if there's a separate research team, like user research team, they're the ones who've done the research, and they're telling you the teams are always skeptical. I don't know if you've seen this, and then follow-up question, thoughts about how to overcome it.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, and I see this sometimes also with product ops. Like some companies actually have product ops teams sort of almost like pre-synthesize data to then make recommendations to PMs, like, oh, maybe you should look at this area. And I personally am very much against it because I genuinely believe that is part of the product manager's job, right? Being inquisitive, being investigative, actually digging deep and say, oh, that's weird that people like drop off in this particular part of the funnel. I wonder if we could do something about it. For me, that's almost the creative part of product management, right? Actually going out there and discovering opportunities. So I'm personally very much against it. I think with research teams, it's slightly different. I think they can really add value when it's about really big, longer term research pieces, right? Like they are absolute experts in doing that. They are absolute experts in actually getting statistically significant data, right? Stuff like that. So absolutely, I think research teams are super, super valuable, but I think we do need to enable our PMs to be part of that as well, as much as possible. Not necessarily always being the person in the driver's seat, right? But again, understand the context around it, understand the context around what is being asked, who is being asked, and all of these other things.
What came to mind immediately was like, it's such a dangerous position to be in. This is where I think or a dangerous path, I should say. This is where I think companies or places get into this chase for efficiency at the expense of being effective, right? It's like, oh, it'll be more efficient if somebody else does it. So then like, you don't have to worry about it. Like, don't take all this time to like synthesize this. Like, we'll do the synthesis for you and we'll just tell you what to do. But then you miss out on the shared understanding that comes from that. You miss out on this piece of the puzzle, which is trust. Like, can I trust? Yeah, and it's not like I don't trust you thing. It's just like, I don't know, like show your work in. Like, I don't know how you came to that. So I don't see the data, or you're only showing me the end result. So I'm a little skeptical here. Like, I've got so many questions. And I think the last thing that came to mind that I think is dangerous as well is you really won't build product sense at all, or like empathy with your customers and stuff, which is a piece of product sense, because you've essentially outsourced that. I actually, this is a tangent that we don't necessarily need to get too deep on, but I actually worry about this with AI, by the way. Because all these tools are introducing AI that's like, oh, we'll synthesize it for you, and then you could easily get into this, like, I don't want to say like brainless monkey kind of world, but like you kind of can, right? Which is like, well, I'll just put in the transcripts and then hit the button, and it will tell me that these are the 5 opportunities, and this one's the most important, and I'll just take that one, and then like, I don't know if you have any to add on that or comments, and we don't need to go down that rabbit hole either.
No, I love that. And I think this is part of a broader question around what actually makes product management, right? Because like with the advent of things like product ops and all these AI tools, how many things could we technically outsource, right? Like, okay, you don't need to do your own research. I can just like synthesize stuff for you. You don't need to dig into the data because our new data analytics tool, surfaces the top 3 things you should care about. Okay, you don't need to do prioritization because I've got a fancy algorithm that does it for you. And like, what is left at the end of it, right? And to me, I think if we break down product management, what you're doing is thinking. Like, you use a lot of different prompts and systems and pieces of information to make a decision, right? But if you outsource 90% of that decision making, you're not going to grow as a PM, right? And I think with all of these AI tools, there is such a deep difference between being able to do the thing and then making yourself more efficient with these tools and completely relying on it. Because I work with AI a lot, but I use it to create drafts that I can jump off on, that I can critique, that I can go, "Ooh, I don't think that's actually correct," right? It's never just in isolation. It's never just, okay, hit enter, and whatever it spits out, I'm going to run with it. And that you can only do with experience. And I think that is such an important reminder.
And to cycle it all the way back to what we started with the strategic decision part, you missed that piece of the puzzle. You missed the creative piece. You missed the beliefs and taking a punt on where the future might go. Unfortunately, data can only tell you about the past. That is actually one of the dangerous things with data. And sometimes the future just ends up being a little bit different. So if you're blindly taking what is available to you today based on what you know today without inputting what you believe and some hypotheses and assumptions about the future, yeah, you're going to be left with, you're just going to miss out on that. And I like, and if you going back to what product management is, I think product management is being able to do that, and that's why it's so hard. It's
100%.
taking those things in and taking a punt. The question that just popped in might be actually relevant to the next piece. So I want to go to the start because we have not followed this in order. Yeah, that's, well, product's non-linear. This webinar is non-linear.
I love it.
Yeah. The first one was focused on customer focused, was about being customer focused. Some of the stats that were thrown in there that you found was basically 30% say that they are always guided by feedback, at least product iterations and strategy. I don't know what the split might have been between that. 52% say it happens occasionally, 16% rarely. Yeah, this disparity as well you mentioned. I don't want to throw too many things in there, but did that surprise you? Yeah.
I think what surprised me most really was the disparity, right? So this difference between what leaders think and what ICs think, what product ops think. So usually leaders are the most optimistic, right? And then product ops and ICs are pretty close, with product ops being slightly more pessimistic, which I find really interesting because that is really, it's about flight levels. Right. And I think it's something that I noticed as well when I started talking about product ops in general. And I've been talking about product ops for about 5 years now. Right. And a lot of the time, especially when it first started out as a concept, ICs really got it, right? Especially the ones who really acutely felt the pain. They're like, yes, like I would love to have a person like that on my team. I am constantly busy doing work about the work. I don't actually get to speak to customers. I don't actually get to look at the data. I don't have the time to do this meaningful thinking I need to do to progress the product. Whereas the higher up the ladder you go, right up to CPO, they have a pretty rosy picture of what's going on. Right. And I think part of it, of course, is due to them not being embedded in every team's every day, which absolutely makes sense. It's also not something I would advocate for. But it's very interesting when that starts having an impact on the next role you hire, right? And the CPO's idea of the next best candidate or the next best role to fill might be completely different to a product team that's currently struggling. But I think customer feedback, just to bring it back to the topic in general, I think it's quite similar to the data topic, honestly. I think organizationally, typically there are a lot of barriers to really doing this successfully, whether that is simply having the knowledge, but also empowering PMs with making it easy, right? And I think that's where product ops can really come in. I'm not going to do the research for you. I'm not going to schedule your customer interviews, right? But I'm going to give you the tools so that you can have a really quick turnaround. That if there are legal documents to sign, you know exactly where to find them. You know what the guidelines are. You know, if you're in a B2B space, which customers are happy to be involved, etc., etc., etc.
I think there's a definitely common theme with like good product ops versus like not so good implemented product
Right.
ops where we're focused on, like from product ops perspective, when I say we, is on enabling teams and how
Yeah.
do we create, like, it's not a dependency thing, it's really like enabling them and making their lives easier, as you said, removing those blockers, not necessarily doing it for you or becoming that thing. The flight levels thing is interesting too. I think there's disparity, and just to be very clear to everyone, what we're talking about here is like, so 50% of leaders actually said tick the always thing, right?
Yeah.
And then but 65% of ICs actually said not always. They said occasionally or rarely. And then it got even worse when we got to product ops, where 70% said rarely or occasionally. I thought about a few things on this one that I'd be interested to get your thoughts on. How much it's, because one of the things I thought about was like, how much of this is actually the levels itself and like optics. So when you're an IC, as an example, you're making way more day-to-day micro decisions. So your decision
Right.
volume, the number of decisions you're making, is likely larger than a CPO, unless you have a very controlling CPO that wants to counter mode everything. But so is it a byproduct of volume that like they just feel like it's not as much, and then or a byproduct of levels? Maybe it's both, where at a top level you're making these bigger bets, so you want to slow it down and want to be due diligence. The other thing I thought about was the iceberg of ignorance that I think Toyota kind of found. I was like, how much is it maybe that they're just like ignorant to all these decisions being made without data? I don't know what your thoughts.
Yeah, very interesting. I didn't really consider the volume up until now, but you make a very good point and I think that also probably reflects the reality both of us have seen, right? The big strategic bets, you invest time into researching those. You make sure that the voice of the customer is there. And the smaller everyday, improve the funnel, whatever it is, so your standard feature that you will ship in 2 weeks is less likely to get customer attention. That's a very, very good point. Question is, at what point does it become necessary? Right. And I actually don't think you need to do discovery on absolutely everything, right? Like if you're building an e-commerce website, like just build the checkout flow like everybody else builds the checkout flow. Like there's no need to
just copy that.
like there's absolutely no need to revolutionize how to put things in your basket. I years ago I worked at a startup that rigorously A/B tested absolutely everything, and we actually made our payment screen worse by trying to revolutionize it. So, word of caution, like really, like some things are just standardized by now, right? Not every single thing needs discovery, but yeah, I think it's a very interesting talking point, right? The different levels and whether what we're seeing is actually, I mean, even correct, right? Because I think to a certain extent, ICs and product ops folks also tend to be maybe a little bit more pessimistic, because it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction to like, well, I think I should be doing more research, so I think I rarely do it, right?
Yes, and then the volume thing I thought about as well from a product ops perspective, because they're across many different teams, and there's probably some averaging out that's happening there. Perhaps I'm making assumptions that where like one team might be on the higher end, like they're doing a lot of data informed decisions, and then there's some other team that's like trailing, and then you're thinking, when you're answering the question, you're like, well, that team's not doing that well, so we could do better.
Right.
So
Right.
there's like this exposure type thing. To bring this down to some actionable things too, I do like your point about the fact that not everything needs discovery. for sure. Like absolutely for sure. There is definitely things that literally I think the checkout or something is some great examples where the question for me is really like there's a few questions and I'm keen to hear your thoughts around like how important is this? Is this like core product functionality that's like really core value proposition? Then yeah, we should probably definitely test it, data, customer research, etc. Versus something that's like like I forgot password flow, for example. No one's going to switch from a competitor to you because your forgot password flow is like the bee's knees. Is like sorry,
Excellent. Yeah.
that's the example I like to use. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think it's also about, right, and you touched upon it, what's your core differentiator, right? What is the crux of your product, the essence of your product, right? If you're, I don't know, a Kindle competitor, right? It's really, really important how you display books, how you get those books, right? Those are things you really want to do meaningful discovery on. But like you say, if it's about changing the brightness, right? It's a slider. Like just do a slider and everybody's happy. So I think that's a very valid point.
And if those who probably feel like they're in a space where maybe things are hard, getting access to customers,
Yeah.
that type of stuff, what's a small step that they can take to get that little step closer to customers and notch themselves up those statistics to be a little bit
Yeah.
more customer focused?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the time we tend to forget the data that's already available, qualitative and quantitative, in our own organization, right? It's likely that you have some sort of customer support or success function. Like, go to them. They have such a wealth of information and experience. They are being barraged by customers every single day with everything that is wrong with your product, right? Like, talk to them. If you can, even shadow them for a little while. If you're in a B2B organization, like, make best friends with your sales folks, right? And I think it's just like, I like to call this like guerrilla product management, where you try and find ways of doing good practices without necessarily asking for permission or without it being codified, right? And I think if you're really in a space where you have zero access to customers, what you need to do to change that is to kind of prove that it works, right? So something I like to recommend is, if you're in B2B, for example, ask if you can just sit in on sales calls, right? You don't need to be on screen, camera off, whatever it is. If you're in the same room, even better, just sit there, take some notes, right? And then maybe ask follow-up questions to your salesperson after the call. Try to better understand your customers that way and make a case for why that should be a more regular thing. And the greatest case you can make is by saying, listen, I had this initiative on my desk. I was going to go this way, but then I joined a few calls and that took me into this completely different direction, and it worked, right? It's hard to do if you don't have the systems in place that facilitate that, but it is possible. And yeah, I think really, if you have zero access to customers, look inwards, because your organization does have access to customers.
I like the guerrilla one, product management. I haven't used that term, but I've called it like scrappy and stuff. Like there's definitely an
Yeah,
entrepreneurial lens on it.
definitely.
I've just on that last one, if it's actionable and helpful for some people, I've literally drawn like a spectrum. Like here's the end customer, like end user that you want to speak to, but for whatever reasons, barrier, bureaucracy, you can't speak to them. Okay, what's the next best proxy?
Yeah.
Next best, next best, next best, and you essentially build this chain until and then the question becomes like, as you work down it, it's like, well, can you talk to that person? And it's like, oh no, we can't talk to
Yeah.
that person for all these reasons. Like a next best, can you talk to that person? Can you? And then naturally you want to expand back towards the end customer, but there are probably some proxies that are secondary and not the best, but better than nothing, that you can deal with. I'll give an example of like, I'm going to use guerrilla product management that literally came up. And so one of my clients did this. It's a very recent story. They didn't have any existing data on this current system because like data was an afterthought inside the company and they just didn't really have anything. And they're trying to work out how long it takes for some action to be done. And they're like, well, how can we get this? Because we don't have any data. Nobody does it. We're sitting in a room and it's like, well, can we just sit next to him? And they're like, yeah, we can observe him. Oh, yeah. Do you have a stopwatch? It's like, yeah, we have a stopwatch. So they did that. They literally sat next to him and spent a day. And every time they did this action, they started a stopwatch, they stopped the stopwatch, and they took the time. And they built up this data set. And this probably cycles back to the points about data. It's painful when that is like the easier thing to do than to get the data. But unfortunately, you just kind of get guerrilla and you find ways to achieve something outside of it.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, right? Like even when we go to talk about measuring feature success, and there will be a time between your organization deciding to become more data mature and actually being data mature. In that time, you still need to find ways to prove that what you're doing actually delivers value. And there are quite a few scrappy ways you can do that. And yeah, it's going to be a bit of friction and it's not always going to be super straightforward, but it's still better than nothing, right? You can still find indicators anyway that you're going in the right direction.
I actually want to get to the question that's in the comment, and I'm looking at a time. But one thing I wanted to just play back, and I don't know if I'll synthesize it in my head as we're going through this. There is, between those key themes, and it's not all the themes in there, because there were some themes around ways of working, there were some themes around tooling. But if I just think about the kind of these, there's like a cluster of themes that we've gone through so far around data-informed decision-making, customer focus, side of the fence, and confidence in the data as well. And that actually all feels to a degree interrelated. And I'll give you an example, right? So we're talking about being more customer focused and getting customer feedback. And then you've talked about also going and getting existing data. But if I go and get that existing data and I don't trust that existing data, then what am I going to do? Well, I might actually just end up making a decision based on intuition or based on my opinion because I don't have the time for whatever reason and I don't trust the data. And there's so many organizational hoops and barriers to actually go talk to customers and become more customer focused. So then we end up in this. Did I cover all the ones that I had in my head around that one? But there seems to be some type of I don't know, cycle or interrelatedness between it.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think that's a really interesting thing that came out of the report, because as I was looking at all of these readouts of the questions and answers, it's like, this is product operations, right? Like, and when I talk about product ops, I don't necessarily mean you need one person, you need to hire a team, but this is the foundations of how you get work done, right? And a lot of the time that is just not very explicit. It's not that it's not there. It's always there. You're always getting work done, but it's maybe ill-defined. Maybe it's not optimized. Maybe it's very disjointed because it's just been built up over the years of your company scaling, somebody having an opinion about how you should do a very small part of it, but nobody ever really looking at the whole. So to me, all of these issues is like, I could solve this with product ops, right? I could, there's two connectors missing here that would make the whole thing run more smoothly. So that's why I actually love that this topic is becoming more and more popular, because it's really giving organizations the tools to talk about the work that is necessary, but is sometimes lacking focus.
Yeah, and I wonder how much, I was trying to put my finger on what's one leverage point in all of that you could focus on, and it might be the data piece of the puzzle. Like the more you can unlock that, the more we might have trust in data, then everything kind of flows from there, and then hopefully things get better, you get more customer focused. I want to round this out by actually talking about this question with jobs to be done, because I actually think it's an interesting one and it's totally out there. But Eckhart, if I say your name incorrectly, tell me, said, what's the role of jobs to be done should play in product management from your perspective? It was asked right when we started to talk about the customer focus stuff, and we just talked about our view on product management. What's your take?
I love jobs to be done. I think it's such an important framework for thinking about what your product is there to do or fulfill. And I actually really love using it when we think about defining product health or product success metrics, right? Those, let's say, 5 KPIs that everybody should know inside and out. everybody should be able to track, everybody should be able to see, because I think at the end of the day, everything we do in product management is about changing user behavior, right? We try and change it for the better, for the customer, but also so they give us more money, because we are fulfilling a job to be done so well. So I actually love using it in relation to what are we going to measure? What is a successful product or successful app for us?
Yeah, and I would extend that by saying the thing that I love about it's really, to me, it's kind of like a tool in the toolkit, a way of framing things and stuff like that. What I like about mental models like jobs to be done is I feel like they facilitate our thinking to get to a necessary level of depth that leads to better products. That's how I'd frame that. In other words, like, and I always love Christian Clayton, who like he kind of the father of jobs theory, and well, he was, and he when he tells the story about the whole McDonald's story, which was kind of how they ended up with jobs theory, it's so simple to be like, well, everyone's thirsty and they're,
Right.
and they like the flavor of it. Like that's all surface level stuff. I said this is one of my litmus tests for insights. So if you're doing any type of interviews, synthesis, and you are trying to get insights out, here's a very quick litmus test. The insight should be not a duh. So like if someone says, "Oh, it's because milkshakes taste good," it's like that's a nada. Like of course they taste good.
Yeah.
That is not an insight. That's just an obvious thing that somebody just pointed out. A true insight is exactly what he tells in that story. I encourage watching the video, but he basically gets to this conclusion that people are looking for something to do on their commute, and you only have one hand and you're driving, and there's a few other dimensions in that. But that's an insight. Like that's like that's like a mind blow. It should be that GIF. I feel like it. Insights equal that GIF. Not like, oh, no shit, Sherlock, you just told me something that, if you're like, our insights, our customers want it to be easier. It's like, no, bad, delete, try again. Jobs to be done forces you to not do that. No job is going to be
Absolutely.
easy, right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it's really that light bulb moment that you're looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I'm conscious of time. I just read your comment, Peter, as well. I think that I'll throw it up on the screen. He mentioned something about the data being set up and the issue being convoluted and hard to get access to, or long to explain the data and stuff like that. This goes back to, I think, what was floating through my head, which I'm going to think more about, which is like, can you just unlock data? Like if you can unlock this piece of the puzzle, it might have a knock-on effect. But we're kind of at time. Well, we are at time. Thank you, Antonia, for that. We didn't go through all of the challenges, but I think we touched on the ones that I prioritized, which was the strategic decision making. I think product leaders communicating better, show your work in, I think is a huge part. I don't know if we said something controversial as well about strategic decisions not being completely data they're data informed, but being data driven or only based on data. Actually being a good thing because it's a necessary thing. We talked a lot about data, bringing data left, unlocking that piece of the puzzle, getting close to customers, and some of the roles product ops can play in all that. Anything last you want to, I don't know, emphasize, double down on to wrap this up?
Oh goodness, I think as a final aha of the report, I found it very interesting. We had a question around, are processes holding you back? Something like that. And I think as a little act of, let's say, vengeance, or I felt very vindicated when most of the folks say, well, no, it's not actually holding us back. What's holding us back are, I don't know, our tech stack or our tool stack not working well together. It's really not so much about the processes. So I personally felt very vindicated, as I feel like most folks actually use that as the main, let's say, negative thing about product operations. And listen, I'm not going to say there aren't bad product ops folks out there, right? Sometimes, yes, process for process sake does exist. That's not a place anybody wants to be in. But I think it's really refreshing to see that on the whole, what we're doing is actually not only appreciated, but useful.
Yeah, for sure. I was trying to find it because there's the ways of working bit there, but I think it might have
Mm,
been, I think it might have been, I don't know, somewhere. But I agree with you. And I think that was my comment before as well about like this kind of like, I don't want to call it bad product alts, but there's definitely like that process world that's like, yeah,
sure,
like you're just giving us frameworks and process and telling us what to do and
right.
versus enabling and making things easier in life. Well, I'm sure we could have talked for hours on and get deep into the sport, but I yeah wanted to time box this. But thank you. This has actually been selfishly as well. I love hearing your thoughts around it. Obviously, you're closer to the report and getting closer there. It's been a pleasure. It's definitely cemented more in my head and helped me digest this a lot more as well. So selfishly, I'm like, just helping me. I hope everyone found that valuable. It's been a pleasure. I'm always like talking with you. We always have a good chat. I always feel like I learned something as well. I appreciate you doing this and taking time out for it. I appreciate everyone who joined live as well and took time out. Yeah, so thank you. We'll leave it there.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
If you enjoyed the style of this video, then you're going to love my conversation that I have with Kanan, the founder of an AI product management tool Align With. And if you're interested in some of the ways product management is changing and reshaping some of the trends and things that Antonia and I talked about in this video, then check out my video about how product management is changing in 2025. That's 2 options for you. Maybe you'll enjoy both of them, one of them or the other, or none of them. I'll leave it all up to you. Thanks for watching. I hope this was valuable for you. I'll see you at the next one.